think back, you said it was what, what was it?
1989.
1989. That's another, you're in good company. That's a year we like around here. Do you look back on the last, 25 years as a kind of upward slope, or is it sort of a series of peaks? Are there,
no, I think there are peaks in terms of institutions I've been connected with and projects I've done, but there are also peaks of new discoveries in the work which are not necessarily the same. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely a peak which happens early on, which is when you don't know what you are doing. So the first animated film, in a sense, had liberties and things it did because I had no idea what I was doing. And in some ways, the production of Wojciech that is being shown in Budapest at the end of the week also feels like an extraordinary piece of work because we didn't have a clue what we were making when we made it. As soon as the first one was made, the subsequent productions with animation and puppets, in a sense, were so limited by what we knew. It was so much harder to find new ways of thinking. So those are different from places where they are finally seen. I mean, there are certain exhibitions which I remember as being more beautifully installed than others. Mm-hmm.
There was a kind of work.
We did an interesting exercise when I was a student with a group of friends. We all said, all right, this is where we are now. We were either students or just finished being students. Let's imagine 10 years in the future. And everybody of the group had to say what would be their best possible outcome they could imagine for themselves in 10 years' time, and what would be the worst possible outcome they could imagine for themselves in 10 years' time. And then what they thought was their most likely outcome. And some people's most likely outcome was very close to their worst, and some was very close to their best. But at that stage, what it seemed to me impossible, but a kind of ideal dream would be to be able to keep making my work, and to every now and then occasionally have an institution that would show the work or invite me to do a new project. So that seemed an unreachable, but so in that sense, there've been, once that was kind of achieved, once institutions did that, then there was a kind of relief at that, but then it's about what the actual work is. And if one is prone to anxiety, one is awake at 4 in the morning every night, and all that changes is what the anxiety this bird lands on. There are so many branches of what will keep one awake at 4 in the morning, and there's still no shortage of them. I still wake up in a panic.
So instead but instead of, let's say, will I ever have an exhibition, it will be like, what exactly am I doing at the Metropolitan Opera?
No, it would be like the last exhibition seemed to have worked, but the one I'm working on now can only be a disaster. Why did I say I would undertake this project? It's still a sense of how do we get this project to work? How does one rescue something that is
And presumably
happening?
that early morning anxiety is just as productive as failure is in the larger sense.
Sometimes it's productive. Sometimes it's like a dream. I'm sure you're aware when you have a dream, and in your dream you think, God, how clever, what a brilliant idea I've had, what a witty joke I've made, and then you wake up in the morning and you remember it, and it's really completely flat and stupid. Right. So some of the 4 in the morning ideas seem wonderful at 4, but really not great at 8. And there are times when that connection is made, and then the task is to remember it till the morning.
All right, well, drawing. Let's talk about drawing. And we'll come back to different parts of your career at various points. I think you said once drawing is a way of thinking aloud, and you stuck to drawing. I mean, obviously, alongside many, many other things. You stuck to charcoal. Why? I
think it has to do, some artists when they work think in color. So the way of putting 2 colors next to each other or mixing a color is part of the activity of thinking. They need to be doing that activity for their mind to be engaged. For me, drawing, and particularly with charcoal, is a way of thinking aloud in the sense that charcoal, because it is such a flexible medium, I mean, you can draw a line on a sheet of paper, and with a cloth you can wipe it off. There'll be a trace of it, but essentially you're back to a space where you can draw again. So that was important, why charcoal and why drawing. But more fundamentally, I think, because even if I'm working with an actor or I'm working with a piece of film, I think of it as drawing. in the way that the strategy of making a drawing is different from the strategy of usually doing a piece of theater. Which is to say, a drawing is a very primary example of two things, of splitting yourself between being someone making something, being a maker, and being a viewer, and also about the nature of what the membrane is where we meet the world. So when I talk about splitting yourself between being a maker and a viewer, I mean in a very literal sense. You start a drawing, and you think, well, I'm going to draw the torso of a man. And you do a line that's the shoulder and the edge of the torso. And so there's part of you that's made the line, but even as you've made them or as you're making them, there's another self that is assessing what you're doing, judging it, saying, no, that's completely out of proportion. The arm's too high, bring it down. The shape is wrong, change it around. And saying almost as the viewer to the person making, come on, do it properly. You've been to art school, you should know what a body looks like, draw it properly. So you redraw it and then say to the self looking at it, is that better? And the person says, don't be crazy, that's even worse. Just rub it out and start again. So you rub it out and start, and there's this kind of the split conversation that happens. So that's one way in which drawing works. The other is it's always a negotiation between what you see coming towards you, what's on the paper, and what you project into it. So if I do a drawing of a tree, it's a stick and some lines and some marks that make the leaves, and you are watching it as a person looking at the drawing. On the one hand, you can see it's a charcoal mark and some dots and some circles, but there's in your head also that sense of what a tree is, of treeness, that you can project onto the paper and find the negotiation between your image of a tree and the tree as it is on the paper that constructs the image. And in fact, you can make the tree almost more and more schematic and hardly anything there, and only at a very extreme point will you drop the sense of that being a tree. So that negotiation between what's presented and what you project onto it, for me, is fundamental to drawing and looking at a drawing. And so when I'm working with either film or performers, it tries to have that same openness of looking at what you're seeing, recognizing it, having both a voluntary and an involuntary generosity of looking. When you see the drawing, the stick and the branches and the lines and the dots, it's not only about a generosity of your viewing to say, oh, if I really try hard, I can imagine that's a tree. It's also about being unable to stop yourself at a certain point, even when you can see this is just a stupid line and some other lines and some circles, but you can't stop yourself recognizing it as a tree. And much as you would like to say these are a series of abstract diagrammatic marks, there's something in you which constantly is trying to say, what could it be? Solve the riddle. Is it a horse? It's a tree, it's a tree, it's a tree. Much as you would like not to. So I think that's another important part of why drawing and what it is to be drawing.
This idea of stopping yourself is a very good friend of mine in the audience. He'll probably figure out who he is. He's an animation filmmaker and an artist. And I remember 25 years ago talking a lot about how do you know a work of art is finished? I mean, how do you know when a work is when you're ready to move on to the next one? When in the process? It's
made much easier by making animation, because the drawing is finished when it's served its purpose in the film, the narrative purpose in the film.
Right.
If it's just a drawing by itself, it's not easy. Someone always used to say that an artist should have someone standing behind him with a hammer to say, finished, get on with the next picture.
Next.
Next.
So in a way,
you don't.
You don't have to, because of your films, you kind of don't have to answer that question because it's never finished.
No, it's never finished. But I mean, there are a lot of works I do which are etchings, drawings, sculptures, which do have all the same question of when is it finished, when is it overworked, when is it still on completion, and there's no clear. In retrospect, you can say, oh gosh, that piece of work, that painting is perfect the way it was. There was nothing more nor less that Vermeer needed to do or that Velasquez needed to paint on the Infanta upstairs. That was kind of just enough.
So there's no temptation to go back?
Oh, there's lots of temptation to go and either what you think is going to improve and sometimes improve, sometimes.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a couple more questions about these boundaries. Actually, the curator here, David Feher, asked, I mean, at the end of the day, do you consider your work more like drawings or as drawn films?
No, I think of them as, sometimes I think of them as applied drawings.
Applied drawings.
Yes, in other words, like applied mathematics, mathematics in the service of something else.
Okay.
These are drawings in the service of something else, the narrative needs of a film.
Right.
So sometimes they're made that way. They're made as applied drawings.
Right.
But in a very complicated, recondite way, I also think of the films as a strange, complicated way of arriving at a set of drawings that would never have been made if I was just making drawings by themselves.
Right.
So there's a drawing in one of the films which is, in one of the theater pieces wherein I needed a list of the dead, just a list of dead people, which was slowly going to emerge, and we'd, I think it was from the Faustus production, we needed this list of dead people. And so the drawing began as a small name, and gradually as we zoomed out, it became a large sheet filled with names, which was done because it was needed in the film. But in the end, for me, became a really rather beautiful drawing that I would never have either thought of or dared to make as a drawing in itself. And in fact, the production is kind of gone and over, right, and is very unlikely to be revived. And what remains is the drawing. And I don't then say, oh, well, is this nice to have as a record of the production that's passed? Or was the production all done simply to arrive at the drawing? They're both, I don't try to give them a final hierarchy.
Right. So for you, though, I mean, it's what you made it very clear, I think, to everybody that your films sort of were an organic evolution of your drawing. And eventually they ended up being filled more consciously with narrative, more consciously with sort of subject matter that you could only put in given this temporal form. And over time, you sort of became probably the artist best known in the world for doing this kind of work within the confines of the art world. So, so I want to ask you about the sort of place of animation in the sort of pecking order of the arts. And why is it that perhaps to this day, animation, you know, is still a little bit of a peripheral genre alongside sculpture. I mean, there's no department of animation at MoMA, and I don't suspect there ever will be. What does that mean for animation, both pro and con? Does it, as with so many things today, you're quite a dialectician. I suspect there's something good in that as well.
I mean, I never expected there to be a department of animation. Then, you know, there is a department of time-based media, of film, of projections, of video, of whatever different form in which things are shown in. Right. And there's an openness in many museums, such as this museum today, where some years ago it would have been unheard of to think of a piece of animation being put in the same building with the El Grecos and the Goyas. And there has been a change. I mean, when I started, maybe this is for the third part of the conversation, when I started working, if you were an artist, you made oil paintings, or if you lived in America or Europe, you could make some conceptual work. Gradually, it was accepted that drawings could be shown instead of paintings in not just in print cabinets, but in exhibition rooms. And then there was a long period where I had a separation. I made my animated films, such as the films which are shown outside here, and I made drawings. And the first time a curator came and invited one of my films into an exhibition of contemporary art, I was insulted. I said, what is a film doing in an art exhibition? My drawing should be in the exhibition, the film shouldn't be there. How dare he want to show my film?
Where was this, by the way?
This was, it was a person who saw the work in Johannesburg and wanted to show it at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, in England. Curator David Elliott. And fortunately, he insisted, and I was dragged kicking and screaming to actually show the work where, of course, it should be seen. So it wasn't just saying the institutions were conservative. I was as conservative. I was as blind to what the work actually could be. I think what's happened now, certainly with the development of animation as being so central to the world of computing, that many, many more art schools teach animation, because in some ways it's much easier for people coming out of art schools to get jobs in the real world as animators than it is as painters. You know, every website needs its animator. Every movie now needs huge amounts of digital animation. It's a real craft profession, which you can. So there are a lot of art schools that have animation departments, and as a result, there are much more spaces in which making of animation is seen as part of the activity of art making and isn't in the animation restricted world of animation festivals and animation schools.
And do you spend time in those worlds?
No, my films were initially shown in animation festivals, and they still are shown in animation festivals. Mm-hmm. And I know there are a lot of professional animators that thought, what on earth are his films being, why are they showing his films in a museum when he doesn't even really know about animation? Mm. And when I go to animation schools to talk occasionally, I mainly am looking over everyone's shoulder to try to see how it should be done. And every now and then someone comes and says, I'll show you how actually to do a walking cycle. There's a technical way of making someone walk, an animation cycle, which I'd somehow never animated. So the fact that they came out of drawings in movement rather than out of a system of knowledge of animation was a blessing for them, that they came out of the wrong side of animation. The fact that the work was, it feels good fortune that it was seen in the fine art world as well as in the animation world. But there are a lot of artists now who are doing animation, and the rediscovery of many, like Kovacs and I, but other artists in the United States and other places who are being rediscovered and taken out of the specific confines of animation history and seen as part of a broader world of people making images, either static or moving.
So, I mean, for you, it sort of, again, as you described it, it was sort of a series of experiments that sort of gradually pushed you out of that one static drawing. Along the way, were there role models or particular, I mean, your work has a very clear sense of history all over it. I mean, you really feel like it has history on its coattails. But is that conscious or is that just a coincidence?
No, I think that as an art student and as an artist, there's a lot of looking at other artists' work, particularly at artists of the past. Sometimes not in the sense that there's any immediate connection. I mean, I completely love the paintings of Manet, but I don't really expect to work like Manet or to be really doing. But when I look at the Goya paintings upstairs here, there are like 7 things I can immediately try to keep in my head to take with me back to the studio as ways of thinking and working with images. So there are 2 things. I mean, they're seeing some exhibitions work in the sense of there's just an energy back to the studio. It's not that there's anything specific in that the artist is doing which you think I want to copy or reuse or do else, but there's an energy of the pleasure of making that sends you back to the studio. And then there are other works where you think, oh, I can see what he's doing there, but I want to do the same thing, or I want to work it further, or I want to play with an idea that it has sparked. So there weren't, I mean, there was McLaren, the great Scottish animator, I think, although he worked in Canada a lot, whose work I saw when I was maybe 15, that suddenly showed me you could do animation that wasn't like Disney. I certainly hadn't seen the great works of Eastern European animation that existed at the time. I saw those much later.
It's an art form that's always had a particular role over here, and I'm about to ask you specifically about that. But before I do, this whole question of where does it fit in has come up in interesting ways. Actually, another question that came from one of the curators of this museum was based on the observation that your big retrospective exhibition, which I think has now stopped in 6 cities, 8 cities, has been shown in very different ways. In places like the Albertina in Vienna, they were screened consecutively, so you interpreted them as films, as a series of film screenings. In places like New York, for example, or at the Jeux de Paume in Paris, they were played synchronously in separate spaces, so you experienced them as kind of installation art. Does that context matter? Does it have a role in any way?
I think how you see them is important. I mean, I worked very hard for them to be seen, once I understood they could be seen, not just in film festivals, for them to be seen where possible with the drawing, so you understood the process of making the double material, or the one material and the other immaterial form of the drawing and the film. In the touring exhibition, which in fact is now on in Moscow, its shape changes enormously both by the physical space of the institutions. So in Vienna at the Albertina, it had an enormous area to fill. So it in fact was given far more space, and we added far more drawing works because we had the space in different rooms. In some spaces, the emphasis is on the projection space, and there are fewer drawings. So it expands and contracts. I'm very happy to see it in a range of different ways. I think one of the things that's fundamental to it is a huge insecurity in my own judgment. One of the reasons you make films that change the whole time, so you never actually have to make a judgment or a decision. It's kind of being made. You never have to make a clear statement. And in the same way, when the exhibition is being shown in 8 different institutions, you're absolved of saying designing the exhibition. Right. You have 9 different possible transformations of the exhibition.
Yeah. It was a real pleasure, by the way, walking in today and see the expression on your face when you saw your film projected, probably in the largest scale you've ever seen it.
I think the projection outside here is without doubt the largest scale I've ever seen the film projected.
What does that do to it? Maybe not.
Oh, no. It makes me think, next time I'm going to ask for the dimensions of this hall and say, I think that would be a good scale to see the films. Because usually they're often projected 2 meters by 1.5 meters. So to have something that is 10 meters by 7 meters is extraordinarily different. So a huge thank you to the museum for letting me see the work in a new way that I hadn't seen it
as we know,
before.
Innovation always comes from the periphery. One more thing about freedom. The word freedom was used earlier in the introduction by Nora, that you and Kovasnai both, in the context of where you were, took these extraordinary liberties, but maybe animation itself has something to do with that. I mean, certainly in this country, there was perhaps a perception that you could sort of get away with things in animation. It's certainly true of Kovasnai, I think, that maybe you couldn't do in film. Somehow film, being sort of real, is taken more seriously. How does that figure into your thinking?
I mean, I think that, there are similarities between 2 repressive societies. Hungary in the 1960s and 70s and South Africa, but they were also very, very different. I mean, there was not a total control. There was never an attempt at saying this has to be a total system with control of what art gets made, what books get written. There was censorship. There was a lot of censorship of documentary filmmaking, and some of filmmaking, and some of novels. Almost none of image making, because it was seen as so peripheral. There was strong control for pornography. And there used to be a list that was published every Friday in the newspaper of books which had been, or publications declared undesirable by the Publications Control Board. And it would always consist of titles like The War in Angola, A Marxist Approach, and Schoolgirls on Heat. And there'd be a complete combination of pornography, and anything that had to do with Marxism would be the combination.
And sexual pornography.
Yes, and the only time one of my films was shown to the Publications Control Board, which you had to do if it was being shown at a film festival, it came back with the comment that this film contains images of intercourse and fellatio, however they are so badly drawn as not to cause offense.
See, yet another failure.
And it was passed. But otherwise, there was never a sense of a dread of these films won't be shown if they don't meet official approval.
Right.
It was a very different circumstance. Novelists had books banned completely, and filmmakers had a very different time.
Now,
but the only piece of visual art that I know of that was banned was a painting done by a South African artist, Harold Rubin, who did a drawing of the Last Supper in which Christ was portrayed wearing a Christmas hat. And that was deemed blasphemous and stopped.
Beyond the pale.
But otherwise, it was very difficult for...
Now, you yourself, I mean, just to maybe weave back a little biography, I mean, you yourself obviously came from the center of the society. I mean, your father was although very progressive, but a, major figure. Your family, I mean,
I think there were many centers, because there were many societies. There was the center of the power elite, which was Afrikaner nationalist government that ran the country. There was a center of black South African life, which would have been liberation movements in opposition to the government. There would be a center of liberal life, of people in professions, and particularly the legal professions, such as my parents were in which they were central to that life. And in a way, the liberal life turned within very set parameters. So there was a sense in which there were draconian laws controlling people's lives of white people and black people. But there was also a belief from the government that they had an open judiciary. So even though the laws were so restrictive, there was a space for legal opposition to them, to the sentences, to what happened. Many which met with failures, but many of which still felt worth fighting by. And I'm not sure if that's the same but I would imagine. South Africa, there was a choice from liberals, which split many families, those who chose to emigrate rather than live where they were the willing or unwilling beneficiaries of a series of laws of discrimination and privilege, in which some of my aunts and uncles chose to leave the country, but my parents and my family chose to stay. And there seemed to be valid arguments to be made on both sides of the equation.
I mean, this kind of leads us into this whole second area I wanted us to talk about, which is locating yourself in a society as an artist. I mean, when you grew up, how profoundly were you shaped by the understanding that you were living in a society where, social injustice was prevalent?
I mean, I think it was an unusual white South African childhood because it was so much part of the family experience. My parents working in the law that dealt with these questions all the time. There wasn't a time when I could imagine suddenly learning, oh, this is an unnatural, evil society we're living in. That was always kind of the understanding. We were living in unnatural times with an illogical, dislocated reality of what the society was. It seemed unchangeable. It wasn't that it seemed fragile, it seemed immovable. It seemed completely immovable, the way I'm sure in the 60s or 70s it would have seemed immovable that the Soviet Union would ever change. Or the 80s, and also the 80s. In the 80s there were members of the liberation movement, South African expert political theorists who said it's going to be 30 years before South Africa changes. And when it happened as quickly as it changed here.
But going back, and I shared your experience when I left in 1988. I had no idea that 1 year later what would happen, even though there were many signs. Right? So that is to say, as you were becoming an artist, as you decided to be an artist, to what extent were those choices shaped by the need to be critical? Did you see yourself as being political in any way, or were you sort of happily going about being creative?
No. I mean, there were two phases to me being an artist. The first one was very much about, in the theater work and in the image making, it was a sense of not exactly a Leninist question of what is to be done, what are the images that are needed, but it was very much how does the work fit into the anti-apartheid struggle. So the theater work was done with partly done with, and for trade unions, and posters done for trade union rallies and things like that. And then at a certain point I understood that there was this huge disjunction between my thinking on behalf of others and the actual interest and understanding of the world I had myself. And it was only when I came back many years later and was working in my studio with things that interested me that they actually... So there was that pressure and that was that sense. It also meant that the art that was being made in other parts of the world, I mean, when I was growing up as a student, which was being in the 70s, the art that was being seen and that was being made that I was aware of was color field painting in America, Helen Frankenthaler, Jules Olitsky, the end of American abstraction, or the incomprehensible politics of conceptual artists like Joseph Beuys, where reports would come back to South Africa, there's this crazy German artist, and he's pumping honey around a museum, and he thinks that's politics, or he's calling people to have a discussion outside the museum, and he thinks that's what politics is.
What
When we knew that, I mean, politics was the security police taking people at night, putting electrodes on their testicles, locking people up, falling out of windows. It was a very different sense. And I thought that was not going to get solved by pumping honey around a building or by meeting 4 art students and talking about social sculpture. I think I was naive in not understanding what he was doing. But there was a way in which those models of modernism and the trajectory of modernism that ended up either with American abstraction or post-World War II European conceptualism, neither of those held. And so I looked for models of the modernist project that was still connected to a political question and also still connected to figuration. So that took me back on the one hand to German Expressionism and Max Beckmann, and to questions of the Russian artists around 1915 to 1930. Mm-hmm. Trying to say what were the formal inventions that could be made, what were the ways of still connecting to the world and embracing the adventure of modernism rather than a 19th century academic drawing.
There was no agenda of reform. There was no thought on your part that by doing this you could change your environment around you.
There was in the first stage, and then when I stopped, I gave that. When I came back, it was without that expectation at all. It was with a strong belief of the importance of being in the studio and of saying, as a political activist, I'm really not going to be a success. I'm not going to be an underground fighter. I'm not a soldier. But there is something that comes from the dedication to the activity in the studio and pursuing that activity as hard and as well as one can, that has not just a value in itself, which it does, but that through that valuing of the activity, there is a way in which one connects to how people either reinforce themselves, transform themselves, and that was done entirely by reflecting on what are the things, how had I been constructed? And it's a mixture of things one's read, books one's seen, films one's seen, songs.
So it's a kind of a monk-like approach. I mean, sort of.
No, it's not a monk-like approach. It's a much more sense of saying, I understand the importance for how people construct themselves through what they've seen, what they've read, the pictures they've seen, and that it's not a solitary activity. The making of it may be solitary, but that it nonetheless is vital for how the individuals who will transform society or who will be part of society see themselves and make themselves.
I think that's very interesting because, again, you're in very good company. Because I think there are a whole generation of Hungarian artists who arguably saw their life as a project more so than the artistic embodiment of their work. One of the perceptions we had walking through the National Gallery that the art of the 60s and 70s was so quiet, it was barely there, small, not particularly much to look at, because the project had become the artist's life as a form of, as a statement against the status quo. Is that an analogy?
No, I don't think it is, because I think it's not like the internal exile.
Right, so you felt integrated.
It was not that at all. It was important that the works could be seen, but it wasn't a sense that I would hold up this picture and 20,000 would stand up and march around the stadium. And I mean, the moment that collapsed is very clear. I was part of a theater group, and we would do performances for trade unions, and it was a time of enormous worker upheaval in South Africa. And we went to one rally which had 20,000 people there in a soccer stadium, and we were performing on the flatbed truck in the middle of the arena, and this looked like the pictures of Mayakovsky's troops in the 1920s. And we were in the middle of our performance, and it was a mixed group, black actors, white actors. And someone in the crowd started playing a trumpet. And then he got up from his seat and started walking around the athletics track at the edge of the stadium, the edge of the soccer stadium. And within 5 minutes, the 20,000 people were walking round and round the edge of the track, singing and ululating. And our production was kind of desperately continuing in the middle, completely ignored by everyone in the stadium. And that's when I understood there was this unbridgeable gap between what I thought I was doing and what was actually happening. And I thought, just retire to the studio and think again.
Now, of course, meanwhile, I'm guessing this is in the 80s, sometimes this situation.